So really excited to have a fantastic Grand Round speaker for this moment, Dr. White-Newsome. Throughout her career, she has worked to advance environmental justice, equity, and environmental health. She has a technical background in environmental engineering and chemical engineering, but her most recent role was the Federal Chief Environmental Justice Officer at the White House Council on Environmental Quality in the first Office of Environmental Justice at the White House. Most recently, after leaving that position, she is going back to her strategic consulting firm, which is called Empowering a Green Environmental Economy. And we're really excited to have her here. And again, for students who didn't hear me say it the first time, I'll put it in the chat, but please hang out after her presentation to be able to talk to her. Thank you so much, Dr. White-Newsome. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Gigi, for the introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here to see names and faces, some folks I'm familiar with, some new faces of faculty and students, and other folks are listening in today. My goodness, it is a lot going on. But I definitely also want to begin where I think it's important is that I'm calling from Southeastern Michigan, the original indigenous lands of the Potawatomi peoples. And when we think about, again, the importance of acknowledging our indigenous ancestors, it's also critical that for this month in particular, that I acknowledge my African ancestors. And so, again, albeit the shortest month of the year, we have to celebrate, remember, renew, and just have gratitude for the sacrifices and contributions of African Americans to this country that we call the United States. And as always, I give honor to my grandparents that migrated up from Mississippi and Louisiana by way of Ohio to Detroit, where I was eventually raised and enjoyed the majority of my life. So again, very proud of my history, and very proud to be a native of Detroit for many reasons. When I think about the city of Detroit, it showed me the importance for fighting for justice and civil rights and uplifted leaders that really took care of community and each other. And when I was in high school, in fact, I was exposed to the realities of environmental racism and the role that both private industry and government play at all levels, perpetuating this reality for many Black and Brown communities. And the reality is, whether you are in the city or in the fields, we have spaces and places that are literally hazardous to the health of folks because of bad planning, because of lack of enforcement of environmental regulations, because of capitalism, and sometimes the sheer devaluing of lives. So when I think about the time that I lived in the wonderful state of Maryland for the first time a couple of decades ago, I realized very quickly that Baltimore felt a lot like Detroit. I would turn on the news and I thought I was at home. But what was also just apparent was this determined spirit of the folks that lived in Baltimore, the history, the culture, the great churches, and the great food. I mean, who doesn't love a crab cake, right? It just made me feel like home. But what was also made for me strikingly familiar was the challenges with local government, the prevalence of Black and Brown babies being poisoned by lead, the inadequate funding of the educational system, the concerns with violence when I turned on the TV, and the impact that industry and manufacturing had on poor communities and Black and Brown communities. It was so similar. So I got my first taste of Baltimore when I was an undergrad at Northwestern University. And I had a summer internship at a chemical manufacturing facility in Curtis Bay. I believe it was off East Patapsco Avenue in a very heavy industrial area that I think at that time had oil and tires and other chemical manufacturing. Again, that was a couple of decades ago. But again, much of these activities happen to be heavily concentrated in poor communities and Black and Brown communities. Much of what I witnessed in Detroit, what I witnessed on the South Side of Chicago in undergrad, and of course in Baltimore. And then when I came back to Maryland years later, at this time I was working for the Maryland Department of the Environment. as a public health engineer in the Philbrick administration. And I had the opportunity to really understand the role that institutions like government must play in the transformation of a community. And at that time, I was in the Air and Radiation Division, or what they call the Air and Radiation Division. And I supported air quality and the promotion of alternative means of transporting. So back then, CNG vehicles were a big thing. We only had like one or two hybrids at the agency. So that tells you how long ago this was. But beyond my main role, I had an opportunity to support our one director of environmental justice at the department. And so I got a chance to go across the state of Maryland and host, again, local conversations about the concerns, again, in rural and urban communities. I got a chance to construct community benefit agreements across the state of Maryland and really support the Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities, which I think might still be alive and well. But regardless, I learned so much during that time. But most importantly, I learned that in order for us to achieve environmental justice, it takes all of us. So everyone has a role, even though sometimes we might not understand what our role is and what it should be. And the role of an institution like Johns Hopkins, very much embedded in the heart of Baltimore and many other institutions that are situated similarly, is a critical one. The mission of Johns Hopkins University, I believe, is to educate your students and cultivate their capacity for lifelong learning, to foster independent and original research, and to bring the benefits of discovery to the world. Or as the first president, Daniel Gillum, said in 1876, knowledge for the world is what you do. And that quest for new knowledge for the world, I would posit, is not only new knowledge, but also knowledge that includes acknowledging your past. So in my research, I learned that as an institution, you started the Hard Histories of Hopkins project to explore how racism has been produced and permitted to persist as a part of the structure and practice. And that is notable. And while there are many aspects that make up this hard history for all of us, one of my first connections to Hopkins was learning the story of Miss Henrietta Lacks and why and how we do our work in the pursuit of science and health should not sacrifice our standards of ethics and definitely make it uncomfortable to profit off people without their permission. It is our job to understand where we came from, the systemic, the unconscionable parts of our past, to create that more equitable path that will take us where we're going. And right now, in this season we are in this great country, again, that we call the United States, particularly across the federal government, it can be a little hard to see a path forward, a better path towards equity and justice that many of us are striving for. But there are some parts of history that are not all bad, but can remind us that we can do good, we can be better, and we can achieve our environmental justice dreams. At least that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So when I think about, for the last couple of years, I had the honor of serving as the Federal Chief Environmental Justice Officer at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. Many folks don't know what CEQ is, but basically we're one of the policy councils in the Executive Office of the President, and our job was to execute President Biden and Vice President Harris's agenda. So again, our mission at the Council on Environmental Quality was to protect public health and the environment. And so again, while every institution has its challenges, including the White House, we were able to make some things happen. My dedicated, small, and mighty staff, with the help of a group of committed and passionate civil servants across more than 20 federal agencies, and the wisdom we received from our federal advisory group, we did the best to make the Biden-Harris vision on environmental justice a reality. And it's important, so I don't have any slides, so you're just gonna have to bear with me talking, but I wanna take some time to speak to the evidence of our work. Because yes, it's been erased from websites, and a lot of other things are happening. But what they cannot do, this current administration, is erase our stories, erase our knowledge, erase the relationships and the partnerships and the infrastructure beyond the federal government that was built during that time. So again, during my time at the White House, I traveled across the country, and many folks, again, didn't know our office existed. And so there are a couple things, key things that I want you to know that we were able to accomplish. The first was with the first executive order that President Biden signed, Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. You can still find that in the Federal Register. It's not on the website, but on the Federal Register's website. So again, there were a lot of things that were part of that executive order, but one of the seminal initiatives was the Justice 40 initiative. And the goal of this initiative was to make sure that disadvantaged communities that were overpolluted, that were underinvested in, actually got at least 40% of the resources, so grants and loans and other resources to advance environmental justice, sustainability, climate change mitigation. The list goes on and on. And what I'm happy to say and share, even though it's not on the government website, is that we exceeded that goal. We actually got about 71% of resources out into these communities that were considered disadvantaged. And that was a huge accomplishment. But again, you wouldn't know that if I didn't tell you. The second executive order, 14096, revitalizing our nation's commitment to environmental justice for all, again, was building on the foundation, the great foundation of the Clinton era executive order. But this new executive order, 14096, which you can download from the Federal Register website, gave us the first ever government definition of environmental justice. It talked about cumulative impacts, climate change, having agencies create strategic plans and enhance accountability, so many different things. And I encourage you to look at that text. And this was something, again, that many of our community leaders across the country helped create. So we did not just draft it in our ivory tower. It was really created by the voices and the concerns that we heard from across this country. The other pieces, we developed, again, technical support in terms of tools. And I hope folks in the room, again, climate and economic justice screening tool, better known as our CGIS tool, was that geospatial mapping tool that helped our federal agencies and other partners identify those disadvantaged communities. Because, you know, sometimes people will say, well, we don't know where these communities are, and we don't know where we should target or prioritize resources. Well, that spacing tool, that spatial, again, tool, got rid of those excuses. And so, again, that was a big part of advancing President Biden's Justice 40 initiative. We also developed the first environmental justice scorecard. We had, again, a wonderful council of interagencies that advanced environmental justice and worked hard to institutionalize it based on their missions. And of course, we had our WEJAC, our Environmental Justice Advisory Council, that again were over 30 presidentially appointed EJ leaders from across the country that really told us how to do our work. So everything, all these initiatives, again, were built on the guidance and wisdom of community and those that were experiencing frontline experiences with environmental racism. The other piece that I think is important that I want to share is we developed what we call the White House Campaign for Environmental Justice. And through this campaign, we were asked to come into different communities, to leave DC and get on the ground and see what was really going on. And even though, as I'd say many times, Council on Environmental Quality, you know, we didn't have a lot of money. We didn't give away grants like agencies, but the power that we did have was to convene people. And so when we would go into different communities, they would tell us, well, we need to have this agency present, or we can't get this person to come to the table. And so from Savannah, Georgia to LA to South Carolina, that is exactly what we did through the campaign: set tables, bring people together to have those hard conversations. But most importantly, and I could go on and on about what we really tried to do and solidify, I think the most critical thing is that environmental justice was no longer an afterthought with the last administration. It became a key component of policy analysis, of conversations. It was a noted gap on implementation and execution. So again, it was not an afterthought, which is so important. So again, as much as it still hurts to say, the work of the first Office of Environmental Justice is now a part of history. It is the legacy that President Biden and Vice President Harris wanted to lead. And despite what has transpired over the last 25 days or so, again, each of us have a role in continuing that legacy of advancing environmental justice. And I firmly believe just because there is a shift in administration at the federal level, a shift in values, a shift in focus, a shift in, humanity, that does not allow us to backslide. And what I always say and will continue to say is that from an environmental justice perspective, environmental justice didn't start with the federal government and it will not end with the federal government. So each of us in our roles in community, as in nonprofits, as lawyers, as academics, have a critical role in making sure that we build on the foundation of the last administration to keep the momentum of the movement alive and well. So again, our country, which, unless you've been under rock, which I've tried to be under rock, but I haven't been successful, has been under a swift transition since January 20th. If organizations aren't focused on fighting back or playing defense because of all of the reversals, the retractions, the retribution, and the freezing of funds, in their other time, they are actually planning for the future. So it's important to know again that now more than ever that we need institutions like Johns Hopkins and others to not go backwards, to not backslide, to not have a moral lapse, to not go back to the ways that aren't good, that will ultimately revert us into a worser condition. When we know our history, when we know what's right, when we know what works, we can't go back. So if we didn't learn anything, I want you to think about the efforts from our history that have been used to eradicate the history and legacy of Indigenous Black and Brown people. Think about the U.S. Indian Boarding Schools program and this century-long effort by the federal government to destroy Native American culture. Think about the 246 years of forced enslavement of our African brothers and sisters, stolen from their homeland, deemed to be a fraction of a person, and the federal government's complicitness with letting the economic case for slavery override humanity. Think about the reality of our government's policies on redlining and the practice of denying people access to credit because of where they live, even though they're, again, personally qualified. And knowing that historically mortgage lenders, again, widely redline core urban neighborhoods and Black populated neighborhoods. And then there's environmental racism, driven by, again, this lack of enforcement, bad planning, the undervaluing of certain people, and the intentional unengagement of the folks that will be impacted by decisions. This perpetual form of racism has its own unhealthy legacy that has caused sickness and death and made some communities across this country uninhabitable. So whether we're talking about boarding schools or enslavement or redlining or environmental racism, this is our history. And if we backslide now, we are definitely destined to repeat it. So the question I posit for today's discussion is, how do we keep from backsliding? How does this great institution of Johns Hopkins, America's first research university, stay steadfast in a time of anxiety, a time of attack, a time of building fear and generating daily confusion by the powers that be in this great nation we call the United States of America? I want to suggest 4 things for you to consider in your role in academia to keep from backsliding. The first is creating community. The second is centering on principles. The third is cultivating the evidence. And the fourth is constant connection. So let's talk about the importance of creating community. I want to tell you, you are not alone. Academics across this country are battling probably many similar questions. Worried about grants? Should I remove certain words that are triggering a possible non-compliance? Where will my resources come if not from the federal government? Particularly if I'm doing anything related to anything that has the words justice, equity, or et cetera. There are groups of scholars that are tackling these questions in real time and creating that community of support, encouragement, and innovation, which it requires. For example, the Tishman Environment and Design School in New York at the New School held a Centering Justice Symposium that brought together and will be bringing together climate and EJ leaders and organizations, particularly allied academic institutions, to explore how higher education can better align with movements and advance partnerships. Those are the types of conversations, and that's just one example that you can create or that you can be a part of. But I think more importantly, I suggest that you make sure that you create the necessary communities within Johns Hopkins. I think about my daughter who's a freshman in college, and this world is a lot for them. Speaking as a former adjunct professor for over a decade and as staff and faculty, it is our job to make sure that we are taking care of the emotional needs of our students beyond the needs of getting grant money and research. I had a very young staff at the White House, and the toll and the experience of that defeat and the fear was real. And we can't assume that everyone handles this disruption in healthy ways. And so creating those spaces for conversation and support are so necessary, especially making sure that students of color feel seen and heard during these times. And as a product of a predominantly white institution, many times I felt invisible. And this promotion of building this colorblind society that our current federal administration is pushing does not make that reality any easier. So I encourage you to realize the importance of building community, not only to maintain and support, again, the research and the funding and the grants, but to maintain and support your moral compass that will help prevent the backsliding that is easy to do when there's fear and anxiety and loss. That's the reality. Secondly, I believe that we must remain centered on principles. If you know anything about the environmental justice movement and anyone that claims to do environmental justice work, you must know the 17 principles of environmental justice. And if you don't, I question your EJ street cred. These principles were first developed at the first National People of Color Summit in the early 90s by community leaders across this country. And they remain foundational to environmental justice work. And for me, it has been my constant North Star, regardless of where I've been in whatever job. And even when times seemed a little bit dark, leaning on these principles, again, reminded me that this will be our liberation. Now, possibly Johns Hopkins might not have any EJ principles per se, but I encourage you to think about what are the values you hold dear? What are you committed to in operationalizing your work? How do you consistently embed and remind yourselves what you stand for? I raise this because I am thoroughly impressed by the range of scholarship and research that the Department of Environmental Health and Engineering is engaged in. Just a little bit I was able to glean from the website. It's amazing. And again, as a chemical and environmental engineer with a doctorate in environmental health sciences, I believe that synergy and cross-pollination is exactly what we need. I'll just say, and I'm probably, again, very much dating myself, when I was in engineering school, there was rarely a conversation about health or justice. It was about balancing the chemical equation and figuring out in the chemi lab, how do I get the right quality and quantity of product? That was the goal. But those of you that represent students and faculty and staff, you have this wonderful opportunity to live into your mission by using, again, fundamental science to protect the health of the environment and its inhabitants. And how you do that in your work related to planetary health, water resource economics, transportation, air pollution, and the variety of research you are leading is to frequently test your work, test your policies, and test your processes against your principles. And if any way what you are doing in your research and your scholarship or your service does not align or support those principles or values, it's time to reassess, it's time to regroup, and it's time to redirect. So at this time in our country where the mainstream conversation is working to drive us away from our sense of morality, We must stay committed in the spaces that we hold. Your principles as a school, as well as the guiding documents like the roadmap to address diversity, equity, and inclusion, sets new goals and priorities. Again, that should be, all these should be living documents. And so as an institution, as staff, as faculty and students, and ultimately the communities of Baltimore you interact with and are accountable to, it is your task to think creatively on how you continue this work for equity and justice, holding on to the principles and the values that you were founded on. All right, I hope you're still with me. The third piece to keep from backsliding is to cultivate the evidence. Creating the evidence, building the case is a significant role of an institution. At the White House, we worked hard to build this body of work, a process for institutionalization of environmental justice across the entire federal government. Our job was to create tools and resources and frameworks and provide support to ensure that the elements of those executive orders that I talked about earlier were being operationalized, and that our federal agency partners were tracking their progress and grabbing the data that would make it easy for us to tell the public what progress we were making. So 4 years from now, folks are going to ask what happened. They're going to ask us what happened under the last administration that really moved environmental justice forward. What is the proof? What is the stories? Where's the record? Where's the data that shows that we were here? And as I think about the work I am committed to now that I'm outside of the federal government, it will be collecting that evidence of our investments from the last administration. Example, Justice 40 Initiative, we know the money got out there. Those were seeds that were planted, seeds that will hopefully grow into something beautiful in the next 4 to 10 years. And we got to track that. We got to look at what were the results of improved health in communities, what monies were able to be leveraged from those initial investments. And more importantly, how was less burden put on communities that didn't deserve it in the first place? So my question for each of you, how are you collecting the evidence of your work? Not just the data to publish a paper, even though I know that's super important, but the data and the stories and the records that can validate that a commitment to principles, a commitment to morality, a commitment to equity, and a commitment to justice can move the needle, can make a difference, is necessary and not optional, and can get us closer to the mission of your university. That proof is going to be critical moving forward to keep us in the broader structures of academia from backsliding. That evidence, the case for equity and justice, is going to prove very useful to the broader body and work of the movement. And as an engineer, I remember a long time ago in a land far away that I had to create many a numerical proof. And having proof is the key. And one of the many bodies of work that my team and other members of the Executive Office of the President and our agency partners created was an environmental justice science data and research plan. This plan was finalized in July of 2024. And one of the tasks that was outlined by us to the President was, again, to create a coordinated strategy to identify and address gaps in science, data, and research related to environmental justice. This was going to be a strategy for our federal government. And so, again, this is one of the documents that, again, solidifies the strategy and the ways that the federal government was going to approach science, data, and research. But this document is still out there. It exists. And using the foundation of this document to help guide the work that you're doing at Hopkins, again, is one way that we can continue that legacy of the Biden-Harris administration, but also continue to cultivate the evidence for justice to keep us from backsliding. All right. Last but not least, we need constant connection. Now, again, this work for justice can be hard. And one of the hardest parts for me, particularly when I was in the White House, beyond the politics, right, was not being able to snap my fingers and make communities whole and healthy again. For some reason, I thought I had some superpowers, but I wasn't able to do that. But people assume that, you're in the White House, you have all this power, you can do anything and everything, but sometimes that is not the case. because we know that there are so many local and state actors that have power, and that power comes into play because ultimately EJ is local. And sometimes at the federal level, we are removed. So when I think about, again, the importance of that first executive order that I talked about from President Biden, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, where he appointed the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, again, EJ leaders from across the country, they were tasked with keeping us connected to reality. Because sometimes you can get in your institutions and be disconnected. So that advisory body, again, gave us recommendations, told us how to do our job, what to look out for on issues of carbon capture, air pollution, everything. And one of the things that was critical was that we had formal public meetings as a part of this body, about 4 a year. And during these public meetings, we had opportunities, and maybe some of you all have participated, where the public could provide comments. 3 minutes to talk about whatever you wanted to talk about. If it was a concern, a criticism, a praise, whatever. And I think that was one of the most important parts of this advisory process, because the public comment periods were hard, they were powerful, but they were necessary. It was a necessary reminder that as we were sitting here virtually meeting most of the time, that people were getting sick. In some cases, people were dying because of environmental racism. It was a reminder of how we needed to do our job. Our role in government was urgent and it mattered to people. That constant connection to reality is so important. And I encourage each of you to, again, continue or start stepping outside of the walls of academia, step outside your classroom, go beyond the lab, and remind yourself of your why. That connection between science and research and reality and real people is necessary to keep us from backsliding. The reason I have done this work for the past 30 years is because I know the people, I see the faces, I remember the stories that I've heard, not only through those public comment periods, but also from family and friends that I have lost that I hold dear to me. And part of why we started the White House Campaign for Environmental Justice that I talked about earlier was for us to get beyond the ivory tower and really connect and build relationships, not engagement, relationships, so we can make sure that our work was having the impact that we wanted it to. So again, my message is simple. And my hope is that at least one person is reminded and inspired to remain committed to the movement for justice, the movement for equity, and ensure that the work of the Academy remains on mission. This institution and many of the institutions that create science and policy and practice have a hard history, but we acknowledge it. We work on active repentance. And then when we know better, we have to do better. So I encourage each of you not to backslide, hold fast to your values, to your ethics, to the utility and the need for good science and evidence building. We need John Hopkins in the movement for environmental justice. So again, remember, create the community you need to survive. Continue to center your work on principles of justice and equity. Cultivate the evidence of progress and maintain that constant connection to the people and challenges your science and your research and your scholarship are working to mitigate. So you stay passionate, so you stay encouraged, even in times where equity and justice are being attacked by the highest powers of this nation. So again, thank you for the opportunity. And of course, a happy Valentine's Day to each of you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing and very inspiring. Please, people who want to ask a question, just use the raise your hand tool because I can't see everybody. Anna.
Thank you so much. That was very inspiring. So how can we stay hopeful? You know, I know you laid it out, but it seems very overwhelming, and um and some days like pushing is just not going to get us enough there, you know. So I would love to hear how some specifics of how you stay hopeful.
And I appreciate that question. And I feel like that has been, I was teasing somebody last night that I feel like I'm a hope dealer
Mhm.
because it is hard. And I mean, we have to acknowledge where we at. I mean, you know, one, even though I'm not surprised and many others aren't surprised of the attacks and, kind of the actions of this current administration, it is still hurtful. It is still a shocker. It is still, you know, just unconscionable. But I think what gives me hope, and I firmly believe that one, as many of the EJ elders tell me, we've been here before, right? So I think about, this is probably a really bad analogy, but I think about a sine curve, right? Like it goes up and down, but we keep on going regardless of what. So we might be down right now, but we are going to eventually come back up. So that hope that the folks that I know have been through this before and they've seen us overcome gives me hope. The second thing is that oftentimes when we are put in, I would say, compromising situations, it allows silos to break down and people that weren't friends to talk to each other. When I think about over the last couple of weeks, the number of organizations that have been coming together, that have been pooling their resources and expertise to help folks, I am so encouraged. So there are people that, again, in these times of craziness and despair, it kind of breaks down those artificial silos that kind of keep us apart, which is really a tool of the enemy. It allows us to come together because we see like, oh my God, regardless of all these things that have kept us apart before, we now have this shared vision. We have this shared thing that we can work on together. And to me, that is encouraging because that is the only way that we are going to get through this is coming together and creating that big tent that includes, again, academia, private industry, philanthropy, our community-based organizations. So I am just witnessing all this activity in the background from all these different folks working together. And so my again, I just anticipate that we are going to have what I've been saying to folks, an awesome project 2029 because I'm witnessing that collaboration and again that hope dealing that we're doing for each other. Um, you know, the third thing is that when I know when we're in kind of periods like this, I encourage you to dig deep. And I say that because the work that, again, and I don't know everybody's particular area, but the work that you're in, I encourage you to ask the question of your science and research and your policy, like, how am I building the case for the future? Or what are you going to do over the next 4 years to make sure that when we get to 2029, there is no doubt that justice and equity, you know, water quality, sheer protections, that should be something that is, not guaranteed to everybody. So what are you going to do right now to make sure that that case is strong? And so I encourage you, again, it's normal to have some grief, it's normal to have some fear and anxiety, but channel that into your work. Make your work even more solid and tight and build the case for justice. So Anna, that's kind of the couple things that keep me going.
So I'm going to read a question that's in the chat. A person, Devin Brown, who can't come on camera. So he writing, I'm coming from the Connecticut Department of Public Health as the Environmental Justice Project Manager. Given that the federal administrations, they're clearly refusing to honor the language that we use to discuss environmental justice, health equity, and affected communities, do you have strategies for communicating our work in the pursuit of grant funds? I imagine this is an issue that many academic institutions doing this work are also grappling with, especially when prior grant applications required folks to explicitly include health equity considerations.
Yeah, and I think Devin, I can't even scroll up and see it, but Devin, I mean, thank you for that question. And I know that there are a lot of folks that are tackling the same question. I was actually, uh, gosh, I think hosting or speaking on a webinar a couple days ago where there were hundreds of grantees, Environmental Protection Agency grantees, where there were city, local, county, departments that, either were recipients, supposed to be recipients of now frozen funds. And really, again, some of my academic colleagues that are, kind of asking these same questions about what are the, how do we talk about this? And so, I mean, there's probably a lot of opinions out there, but, here's the way that I'm thinking about it. And again, I am not full staff at any academic institution, but I think you have to be innovative, right? And so, even if we can't use the words, what we can do is talk about the ultimate goal or the impact that we're striving for. So for me, environmental justice is about health. It is about health and wellness of community, health and wellness of people. And, if that kind of, shifting of language with the same desired outcome as if I said environmental justice or equity, if that will get or allow you to maintain the resources to do the work, I don't care what you call it now over these next 4 years. What's important is the impact that you are trying to create on people. So what you call it, think about what you're trying to do. If it is making water systems whole and sustainable, if it is accelerating, I don't want to say diverse, but different forms of energy sources. I mean, we have to get innovative and creative, because what we cannot let this current administration do is prohibit us where we have a little bit of power from getting that impact that we want. And so again, if your mission is to use science to protect the people, the inhabitants of this earth, then you figure out the most creative way to do that. And I know, again, as a member of the public health department, you are on the front lines, right? And I mean, in many ways, our public health departments, in my humble opinion, don't always get the resources they need to do the work that you do. So that's critical. And so again, Devin, I would just suggest getting creative, not being, and not saying this, but I know some of my colleagues are like, well, if I don't say environmental justice, am I really doing it? Actions speak louder than words. And our goal right now is to keep folks with resources to continue to be able to do the good work.
I have a question about there's so many things going on, and it's overwhelming, all the changes and things that are happening. But what are a couple of things that you're most worried that need action, like sooner versus later, to protect? I know.
I know it is. I mean, here's the thing. I have been, like I tell you, I was laughing last night because I have to laugh sometimes to keep from crying. I feel like I am doing more work now, jobless technically, than when I had a job. And ever since the 20th, it has been just, it's been a lot. I would say the main thing that we need to do is make sure that our friends in philanthropy step up.
Mm-hmm.
We have so many community-based frontline organizations that are very dependent on funding that had, again, been promised obligated monies for community change grants and all the different grants that, again, the last administration was offering. Every day I hear something different. Okay, the funds are not frozen. Oh, you can get into the system again. Oh, no, it's frozen again.
Mm-hmm.
Having the opportunity to have worked at a community-based environmental justice organization it's not like in most cases, there's a stack of cash in the back, like it's a comfy whatever. So we need those that are in a position, foundations, corporate partners, to be that backstop, to step up and see what the immediate needs are of these communities and give them that support. And I know that there are many conversations in philanthropy happening right now. And I just want to encourage my brothers and sisters in philanthropy to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Just like we did in COVID, to respond, we were flexible, and I worked in philanthropy, so I can speak to this a little bit. We were flexible, relaxed some requirements, made it easier for folks to get that money that they needed quickly. We need to think about mechanisms to do that same thing in this situation, because we just don't know when folks are going to be able to get funds. And that could make or break an organization very easily.
Salvatore?
So I know that we were talking about hope, but how do we make it fun? Because I was just out at high school yesterday, doing kind of like community work to do like a low cost sound level meter project. And we were able to kind of get some synergy going with like different groups of students that are going to be using like audio video equipment to like make a video of our project and like how we can kind of transcend from just engineering to like the general student body. So like, what is your strategy to engage the youth to make it fun and make it so it's not so like doom and gloom?
Salvatore, I so appreciate that. And I'm smiling because of a couple of things. I think the arts and music is an incredible way to connect with the youth and just to connect with people. I think the broader strategy for this movement needs to be that we need to make it more inclusive. We need to reach more people. We need to reach those folks that haven't been embedded in environment their entire life and know all of our definitions and all that stuff. And so how do we do that? Particularly with the youth that are just like crazy smart and crazy, just like, just creative. And so I think art and music is a way to make it fun. But I think also, you know, a lot of the work, in my humble opinion, over the next 4 years is going to be local and state based. And so if we can figure out a way to be really clear about what are the actions that our high schoolers, that our middle schoolers can take to advance the movement locally, how powerful would that be? Because we already know our children are, I mean, they are amazing, but we just need to help with like what is that action? Can you write your congressional representative and say, taking away the Inflation Reduction Act funds, sucks, better use better language. But what are the ways that we can get them involved very tactically so they can use their skills and their amazing ways of communicating and reaching people in a way that we haven't used it before? And I was thinking about this because so every Wednesday night, and I go to Zumba, and I actually during COVID became a certified Zumba instructor. And I can say young people came up to me and said, well, I know you were working in DC, how are you doing? Yada, yada, yada. And they said, I'm just scared, but I want to do something, but I just don't know what to do. So it is our job, the folks on this line, is to really come up with like, what are those like specific actions? What can we say to people, instead of, to honest question, like, we have this kind of anxiety and fear and everything. How do we use that? And so what I thought about, Salvatore, is like, can I have a Zumba education environmental party where we dance, have fun, but then you leave with, okay, this is the one thing, this one action that I'm committed to. Or, there's a group of folks that come out of this dance party that want to do something. So, I think this time right now, there are so many opportunities to not only lift up our youth even more, but to engage in really fun ways. Because if we just think about this being just doom and gloom and this is the worst time, then they have won, they have defeated us. But again, while it's so important when you talk about the environmental justice movement, it is intergenerational. And so our young people can get hope from our elders, and our elders can be re-energized by our young people. And, you know, I don't know, I get excited because there's a lot of things that I think we can do in this time, and youth and that intergenerational connections has to be a part of it. So thank you for your question.
I think if there's no more questions, I think that's a perfect note to close on and to lead into the next for any students who want to hang on, just hang on to the Zoom and ask questions off when the recording is stopped. But this has really been such an honor to have you spend time with us today. We are all better for having listened to you, and I really have a lot to think about myself. I'm sure others do too, and how we can keep this work going.